Well, hello and welcome everyone to Curious Minds. Today we have a bit more, I guess, of another serious show, but also something that definitely taps into curiosity and why we need to be more curiosity. And as that intro slide said, show us the money, because that's what we really have to have a better understanding of right now is, where's the money coming from? What is happening with the economy, what is happening with energy, and also how this impacts manufacturing. I am a public relations strategist. I work with people in manufacturing, and often, we talk about the need to connect the dots. So today I have an economist on the show who is also the president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Now, she has quite a lengthy history working in the area of small to mid-sized businesses and advocating for them. She also has worked with the federal government. She has quite a litany of items of experience when it comes to her knowledge of connecting those dots between what's happening in business, what's happening in government, and for us regular citizens as well, because all of those things tie together. In the comments, you'll see more background about our next guest, Catherine Swift. So I encourage you to, read up a bit on her. But here we go. We're going to welcome her to the stage. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Gail. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Well, one of the things I will say I call myself a recovering journalist, and economics is certainly something that wasn't, forced upon us in school. And I think that sort of is a disservice. So I have been of late now being more as an entrepreneur and working in manufacturing, realizing the value of understanding economics. So welcome. I wanted to have you on because of your background in economics and in manufacturing as well, and small to mid-sized businesses. So today is also the House of Commons is back sitting today, and I'm sure there'll be many debates and discussions about the economy, I'm sure. So let's start with why is it important for those in manufacturing to understand what's happening when it comes to the economy?
I guess, well, I'd say any businesses, in manufacturing certainly, but I'd say any business. Naturally, nothing is this. Typically, nothing is the same for all businesses at the same time. So the ideal is to understand what drives your particular business. And there are some, there are some commonalities. Obviously, taxation levels. Say there's one tax rate for small, medium-sized businesses. Typically, there's a provincial one and a federal one, so that affects everybody. So obviously, you want to know the rules as they apply to your particular business, and then demand and supply. Demand for different products goes up and down depending on what else is happening. It's a whole series of interrelationships. For example, if we see a lot of new housing built, that's going to mean we're going to see a demand for furniture. We're going to see a demand for household items, and so on. And what we have right now in our housing market in Canada is a very serious shortage of supply. Demand is there, largely because of our crazy immigration policy, for instance. So when you see that, if you're in the business of wanting to supply householders, then it could be a little bit of a lag before that demand picks up again, because the houses just don't exist right now, nor do the rental accommodations. But there's just a whole lot of interrelationships, such as when interest rates go up, what happens to the value of our dollar? Because we're a country that imports a lot of stuff in Canada. And when our dollar falls, that feeds inflation too. And our dollar is not at a great level right now. So that means that bumps inflation up. So you can prepare better for things if you have a little bit of a clue what the key factors are that influence your business, and then pay attention to them and realize what they can do to other things. Like I say, the interest rate, currency value relationship. But there's lots of, economics is an interesting, it's a so-called social science, right? There is a scientific side to it, mathematical modeling and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of it is also affected by human nature and how people behave in certain instances. And that's actually what attracted me, because I like the hard science part, but I also like the fact that it also had this more subjective element to it as well, that people's behavior factors into it. And anyway, I always find it interesting, and I've never had trouble getting a job. And there's a lot of good economist jokes, mind you. So if you want to know about those, I have a great repertoire of those. But in any event, it's a very interesting area of study, and of course, it affects us all. It's not just businesses.
Yeah.
Look at what all people are worried about with interest rates right now. To give you an example, and one of the things driving that is things like increased taxes. The carbon tax is going to go up again. We're going to see, I think, alcohol taxes go up again. Although we have the McKenzie brothers out again in the advertising in ads, so they were successful last year in postponing that increase. So good luck to them doing it again. We have another carbon tax in the wings as well. And then we have all kinds of other things going up, and government spending, even though they keep saying they're being prudent, they're not. And when government spends a lot, that drives inflation too. So in any event, these are things that affect us all, businesses and consumers, households, and so on. It's good to have a rudimentary, it's not that
Mhm.
complicated to just get a bit of an understanding as to how all these factors influence each other and therefore you ultimately.
And you mentioned this that, and we were talking a bit before the show about, spending. And sometimes I hear things, it's like, well, people will say, well, we'll get money from the federal government, we'll get money from the provincial, we'll get money municipally. And um, it seems that there may be a disconnect between where everybody thinks this money's coming from. Where is the money coming from? I know this sounds like a straight, but where's the money coming from?
I know. No, I agree with you. I hate these ads that say brought to you by the government of Ontario. No, no, no. Brought to you by your wallet. That is who's paying for these ads. We all are. And it makes me crazy to somebody that's dealt with governments for decades now. And when the province says, "Oh, the feds should fund this," well, you know what? I pay taxes to every single one of those levels of government. It's always we, the taxpayer, and we're all taxpayers in one way or another, that gets the brunt of it. And I really wish. Right now we have much too much. Many too many transactions happening between levels of government. A perfect system, which we will never have, but a perfect system would be if the government levied this tax, that tax, it was very visible, very transparent, and then if they raised it, you'd know who to blame. And the same goes for the province, same goes for the municipality. But no, 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 they've all got transfers back and forth. So you have less money in your wallet, and often you're not really sure why. You're not really sure which particular government is giving you is squeezing you more than the others. So I hate that fact, but ultimately we're all paying it, and so we should care about it.
So the other thing that's happening is, and I just saw this come out, it's like money is being handed out, but now there's, I guess, audits of money. And I think it was Pride Toronto or Pride Ontario. I don't know. Did you read that? That
Oh
there was.
yes, yeah, Pride. Yeah, that was a particular news story over the last few days. Pride Toronto was found to have been not accounting for how they were getting the money, and part of the deal was that they would account for it. So if they didn't account for it, well, nobody knows where it went, and therefore they want it back. So I'm sure that'll be quite a blow. I think it's about $1 million and change. So it's not chump change, and so I think that'll be a blow to Pride Toronto, which is never sort of rolling in money. And they're, in fact, their main source of money is government. Period. So that'll be interesting to follow, I guess. But you can name governments, and it depends on the government too. Some are more thrifty than others, as we know. But the federal government right now, boy, it's blowing it out of a fire hose. It has been for years. It has been as soon as they got into power. They could, of course, you can justify it more, say, during the pandemic, even though Canada spent about twice it per capita, relative to the size of our population. Canada spent about twice what other developed countries did on pandemic measures, and much of it was wasted. They just shut down a federal parliamentary committee, as you may have known last week, when they were talking about that the company in Montreal that was supposed to be making vaccine. Nothing ever happened, and it was a good chunk of change. I think it was over $250 million. There was quite a lot of that, of just throwing big pots of money, not just a few million here, but big pots of money at certain people and of course they were all friends of the party in power, right? They were all Liberal buddies that got this money, and often nothing was produced for that money. So it just went into the giant, sinkhole, and so on. Another thing that really bothers me, as a business organization, we don't take a dime from government, not a dime. Most business organizations do, and most other organizations do. In fact, some are majority funded by government. And when you are majority funded by government, you can bet you don't want to risk that. Therefore, say a government, whoever it may be, imposes a policy that's very, very bad for business. Well, if you're on the take from government, you're not going to oppose it, even though you should, because it's a bad policy. And so that's why we are very religious about not taking any money from government, so that we can truly be free to represent the proper view of business. And governments pay tons of it. Like I say, some governments more than others. And when you look at an issue like environmental, all the environmental groups, I mean, I've lost track. There seems to be a new one every week. They're virtually all government funded, some of them getting like 80% of their money from government. And this I find appalling. They have an extreme agenda that is got all kinds of problems with it. I think we're seeing more and more problems come out about all these claims that were made about the climate crisis and the world is burning and all this jazz. The more data we get, the more we see this isn't true. It doesn't mean we don't pay attention to environmental issues. Of course we do, and we want to do the right thing. But we're suffering all these things like carbon taxes. They want to impose a registry on plastics, for example. There's all kinds of foolish policies that don't yield results for the environment, but they make our standard of living worse. And I would rather see some really tangible policies that you can really measure, and they never measure their policies. That's another one. There's a reason they don't measure them. Then people would see how very useless they are. But governments also like to virtue signal, right? Oh, look what we're doing over here. But it's never measured. So you really don't know if anything's happening, and often it is not. Sometimes it makes things worse, like that silly plastic ban we saw on bags and forks and, plastic cutlery and all that stuff. The replacements actually turned out to be worse for the environment. More expensive.
I just want to add in here, Catherine, because I did, for anyone interested in that topic, I did have Christy Armit on my show. And there is another video you can go listen to, because it really is interesting what's happened in the world of plastics. It's also a world that I do work in mold making. But part of having you on as well and having guests is because, you aren't government funded. So I really wanted to have a discussion and really get to the root of, okay, what is happening? And those in manufacturing probably do need to get very involved and interested in what is happening politically. And now with House of Commons back, that's why I wanted to do this show today. So thank you for coming on and kind of casting a light and a spotlight on, I guess, being more curious about what will be happening in these discussions. So we talked, so the economy, connecting the dots between, spending, grant money being given out, and like you said, there seems to be a lot of spending of money, and this is always the issue, because if you look at that spending, the idea is that it's to help build a better economy. But if there isn't any data or any checks and balances on what that money is going to and how is it bringing it back. So that seems to be a missing link. Is that correct?
Yep. 100%. Yeah, it is very, very much so. Another thing, and when you want to look at the big wide world, so to speak, the more macroeconomic, one could say, aspects of it, having a ton of government. We know our federal government's grown like mad. Some of our provincial governments have grown like mad as well. Their spending has grown like crazy. And whenever you expand government like that, you are bound to increase the number of government interactions with business, the amount of so-called red tape, which is useless. There's useful regulation. Obviously, we need to have our food safe. We need to, environmental regulation. If it's sensible, it's necessary. And harassment in the workplace. I mean, you can name a ton of things that need proper, sensible regulation. But there's all kinds of stupid things, like this plastics registry being a good example. You're going to pile all kinds of red tape on business, which costs them money, which means they can't hire a few more people, which they'd rather hire than fill out ridiculous forms for government and so on. And the red tape issue hits small and medium-sized business way harder, because they don't have a big corporation will likely have a whole department dedicated to government red tape, whereas a little business, and about 98% of businesses in Canada have fewer than 20 employees. 98% of them. And they're not going to have somebody dedicated to filling out paper. It's often the owner that does it, not the best use of their time, that's for sure. And of course, it's a cost that ends up, it has to filter through somewhere because most businesses do not have huge profit margins. And as we know, our economy is not in great shape right now. So you sort of have to look at that big picture. A growing government means a shrinking private sector, and government does not contribute tax dollars. The only way you're funding a government really is through the private sector. And I know I have arguments with public sector unions. So, oh, well, we pay taxes too. Well, not really. If you get paid $100 and 20% of it or whatever, actually lots more than that, but anyway, 40% of it goes to government. That's just that isn't an input into the economy. You're just reducing your take somewhat. So public sector doesn't really pay taxes on a net basis, but businesses do from their business as well as from their employees and so on. So I call it the Grecian formula, because in Greece, the government got so large, and the benefits of everybody retired at 50. I mean, it was heaven if you didn't feel like working, and many people didn't feel like working. And we all know what happened there. The economy went into the tank big time, and people suffered terribly. I mean, it was no joke. Because so many people were fired. If you don't have a strong private sector, you're going to have a weak economy. And the bigger government is, the more it weakens that private sector that ultimately foots the bill.
Wow, I didn't know. So like 98% has less than how many?
20 employees.
Wow, that is, these are stats. And while we're speaking of stats, I want stats, not spats, stats. I want to welcome Melissa Mabarky is in the comments. So she says, and Melissa's, I also had Melissa on as a guest. So thank you for stopping by, Melissa. She has some amazing insights from an Indigenous perspective, as well as working in oil and gas. And so she has written tangible results and measurements are what I want to see more of. And
100%.
Now,
100%.
This is an interesting item because, in manufacturing, one of the things I've learned of successful manufacturers are when they start to look at data and they're looking at, what are the numbers? Because if you're running a business, which, I do as well, I have my own business, but the reason I have a bookkeeper is she gives me quarterly results. I know where I am. I know my income. I know my spend. It seems that it seems we've lost our way as a country when it comes to looking at those stats of here's our money, here's what we're spending, what are the results? And now we're faced with inflation, interest rates that people, young people, I think a lot of people are struggling now to whether they can even, keep mortgage, buy a house. So yeah, what up with that?
Well, the measurement thing, Melissa is 100% correct. Governments very rarely measure anything. And again, in my long career of, advising government, that's one of the top 3 recommendations. You got to measure it. And there's a saying, you don't get what you expect, you get what you inspect. You get what you measure. And I find it, we spend tens of billions of dollars on, look at the electric vehicle subsidies right now. In the last few months, there's been $50 billion of our money, and mostly put into profitable foreign companies. They're not even Canadian companies. And the government acts as if it's some massive coup that they bribed people sufficiently with our money to come to Canada. And I would forecast right now that's going to be one of the biggest fiascos we've ever seen. The history of so-called corporate welfare, there's a million names for it, whatever you want to call it, subsidies, corporate welfare. It's usually part of a government top-down industrial strategy. Deadly. Whenever you see those words, just, hold on to your wallet. It's bad news. And just look at the history of them. They've just been a disaster everywhere. And there's a number of reasons they've been a disaster. First of all, the main reason really is that it's politically driven, not economically driven. So the whoever and no particular party, some might do it more than others, but nobody's innocent of this across the political spectrum. But when I see $50 billion go, and we're acting as if it's a coup, Australia did something very clever with their auto industry. They let it die. They found it was much easier, much cheaper for everybody to import, and we import cars anyway, and trucks and so on, to import and not have to heavily subsidize the auto industry. Which, if you look back the decades, it's been subsidized forever. But for example, they'll give a subsidy to somebody that's in a riding of their party, and they're probably not the best recipient of it potentially, but nevertheless, they're in the riding of the party or one of their buddies. I mean, again, the pandemic thing was classic. I knew people in my organization who could very easily have made ventilators, have made some of the personal protective equipment that was necessary, but they're not liberals, so they weren't eligible. And they often gave it to people that never ended up producing anything because, frankly, they really weren't set up to do that. Another thing that's been seen in research for ages is that companies that take a subsidy, and nobody's going to turn down free candy, right? So you say, "Oh, I'm going to give you a few $1 billion." Well, yeah, I'm going to take that. They would have built it anyway. They would have built it anyway, even without the subsidy. Because if the other things aren't there, if you don't have a proper workforce, if you don't have, all the infrastructure issues that a business looks at when they look at where they're going to locate, then they're probably going to do it anyway. So that's another thing that comes out, and it's a waste of taxpayer money. You'd be much better off to lower everybody in businesses' tax levels or do something positive for absolutely everybody and let the best business win instead of cherry picking who you want to benefit. And of course, all the other businesses, their taxes are subsidizing often their competitor. So they're giving one competitor an advantage over all these other businesses who don't take the subsidies, are not eligible for them, or whatever, but nevertheless are very viable businesses. So, in a perfect world, I would say no business subsidies, measurement for sure, as Melissa said, measure everything, measure outcomes, and if it's not bearing fruit, cut it off. But governments, again, they get into the habit, they get their friends. You look at procurement as a classic example, because the bureaucrats get used to a certain firm. And of course, a lot less work for the bureaucrats to say, "Oh, we've already got all your information." Even though we got a lower bid from somebody else, we're used to you. We like you, Joe. We're going to deal with you in the future and so on, even though they could do better with somebody else. So that, that's that human element, I guess, coming into it as well. So subsidies are bad. However, most developed countries do it. And so it's one of those things that's likely going to happen, whether we like it or not.
And it's interesting because working in manufacturing as I do, one of the things that I notice again with successful companies, they want you don't go to the same person each time. Like you may develop that relationship, but you always make sure you're getting other quotes, you're checking in. And I have seen that work where you go and you can actually, it is important to go periodically and not just rely on the same organization or person.
It is, even though it's easier. It's often easier because you know the people. You don't have to collect a whole bunch of information again, and so less work. But the ultimate thing is accountability, right, Gail? If you screw up badly, you might lose your house. You might not eat for a little while, or maybe it's noodles or something. I don't know. But anyway, you suffer the consequences in government. This federal government's been very anti-business, except for the huge firms like the Stellantis. They throw a bunch of our billions of dollars at them, and VW and so on. But what are the consequences? If we as voters keep re-electing governments that are doing dumb stuff, we better look in the mirror when we want to blame somebody, because ultimately everybody's affected. We got a very weak economy right now. We've got big productivity problems. We often compare ourselves to the US. And it's very interesting right now. There's a huge dichotomy between what's happening in the US and what's happening in Canada. They got problems in the US too. Don't get me wrong. They got major debt problems, mind you, so do we. But our productivity has dropped precipitously relative to the US. And again, they're our largest trading partner, so it matters, and other countries as well, to the extent that the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation, Development, has said that in the next 40 years or so, we will have the lowest GDP growth in the entire OECD world, which is basically the developed economy world. And that's not typical for Canada. We're usually up there in the top 10 anyway. And that's pretty bad news. So again, this is too much government, too little private sector is part of this. Heavy ignoring some of our industries, like one of our main industries, oil and gas, is not performing anywhere near to the potential they can, or we should want them to, because every Canadian benefits from success in a big industry sector like that. It's 10% of the economy. That's not tiny. And so the fact government policy is restraining them so much is affecting all of us. And what kills me about it is the hypocrisy, because if we were exporting liquid natural gas, which, as you may recall, Trudeau said there was no business case for, it's funny, there's a business case for everybody but Canada. Funny coincidence that. But we could actually help the amount of emissions in the atmosphere, because LNG is so much cleaner than coal. And we know China, the developed world are the ones, the developing world are the ones that are producing the vast majority of emissions and environmental problems. If we could help them clean up, we would do way more for the globe, for the world climate, than we could ever do as an individual country, paying paying carbon taxes and having emissions limits and all the crazy red tape. We have something like, I think it's 4,000 different regulations, taxes that pertain to the environment. It's such a disaster. And the whole theory behind a carbon tax is that it should be the only measure. If you're going to impose a carbon tax, it should be the only measure that applies, and then it lets the market work, supposedly. But unfortunately, the federal government imposed the tax on top of an already huge pile of regulations, red tape, taxes and preferential treatments and so on, and continues to add on to it, because we're seeing a second carbon tax imposed, and this so-called emissions limits is supposedly going to take place down the road a piece, and so on. So it's a bad policy all round.
One of the things too I've noticed around this topic, that was very good explanation, looking at how to help with eliminating coal, right? Because it would be better to put, when you look at the whole world as opposed to the microcosm of Canada. But what's interesting is looking at, and I often hear this argument when we're looking at, data and stats around moving towards, 100% EV, 100% electric vehicles, and then looking at what the other side of the argument tends to go back to, something that tends to be a little more emotional, which is, well, if you question this, and this is what I want to do, as a former journalist, I always want to say, well, is this the best route to go down this road, right, of 100% electric? But if you question that, sometimes what happens is the emotional argument comes in, that then you're then a climate denier, that you are against the environment. So we seem to have sort of one side or one group or more people wanting to have a more logical debate, and then it's faced with emotion on the other side. Very difficult to bring those two together. Do you have any comments on that?
You're absolutely right. And it's not only on the climate issue, of course. We've heard, I remember during the pandemic, some people said we should close our borders. Oh, that was racist. That was racist, because closing our borders maybe meant keeping for certain, nationalities or whatever out of Canada. And yet about 6 months or so later, the government closed borders because it was a sensible thing to do. Suddenly it wasn't racist anymore. It was magical. We've seen all kinds of things like that. Right now, you're supposedly not be able, you can't criticize immigration. Oh no, that's racist. And what a crock. I mean, it's just such baloney. It's an unintelligent, stupid type of debate to have. You don't look at the facts. Any issue like this is complex. The notion of having useless policies that don't help the environment, yet lower people's standard of living, that's what we got now. And yet some people are saying, oh, well, you can't even talk about that because you'd be a denier. And that denier thing is a disgusting term in and of itself, because it's trying to relate it to the Holocaust. That's the whole point of using that denier word, is trying to put you in the company of the real heinous individuals out there that would deny the Holocaust. And I just find it's something the left tends to do more than anybody else. And I don't quite know why that is. But of course, the goal is to shut you down, to shut you out, to limit free speech. Oh, you can't talk about this issue unless you're gung-ho in favor of it. Don't start, talking about any problems. The EV issue, well, we're never going to have 100% EVs. I'd put serious money on the table right now. We're never going to see 100% EVs. And for the government to dictate that we will all have EVs by 2035? Give me a break. Consumer demand is the thing that's important here. But now that people are actually operating EVs, all those wonderful promises we had at the beginning, oh, you'll save money ultimately. Yeah, they're more expensive up front, but hey, we're giving you a nice big fat subsidy, which of course has proven to basically subsidize the rich at the cost of everybody else out there that pays the taxes that go to the subsidies. We're also seeing problems with the EVs. Look at that cold snap in Alberta recently. We got a big cold country here. A lot of these technologies, and they may improve in 15 years or 10 years or whatever. But right now, with the technology and the data we have now, they are not practical for Canada, except on very sort of narrow applications. Like maybe you need a little runabout in the city. Well, then an electric vehicle might be right. But if you're traveling any kind of distance, I wouldn't have confidence in them. So that means you need two cars, which automatically probably means you got money in the first place. We see they're heavier, much heavier. Accidents with EVs are horrendous because the thing is so heavy. That battery weighs, I don't know exactly, but weighs lots. And so you have an accident and something that could have been a fender bender suddenly ends up with a fatality or a horrible, it's harder on the infrastructure because they're so heavy. And of course, when you have to replace these batteries, you're sometimes looking at 30, 40 grand to replace the battery. And those are just, and we also know we have poor little kids over in Africa and elsewhere mining some of these rare earth minerals that are needed for these batteries. So all the hype that we were sold is dissolving away as we see reality. And it's a shame. And a lot of the environmental issues are like this. And I've read a lot about it. I don't claim to be any environmental scientist, but it is amazing the lies that have been told by that constituency. They should be ashamed of themselves.
Well, I do find this of interest too. Like there's been a lot of money invested, and I live in an area where there's a lot of money invested into a battery plant. It keeps coming up. I know politically that seems to be a big deal because they're talking about, more jobs, and which, yes, I mean, it's always good. I mean, that's another emotional argument, right? Too, because people want to hear more jobs. But the other question, again, from a manufacturing perspective, we're bringing in and having all these batteries being made, but yet on the same time, we're hearing that a lot of these car companies are not deciding to go with electric vehicles. They're now stepping back from it. So
they can't sell them. Yeah. Ford, I was reading a statistic recently. Ford was losing $37,000 on every single EV they were selling. How long do you think that's going to be a model that's going to continue? Well, they're stopping. And yes, people are withdrawing investment from the sector. So, but once again, the truth is prevailing. Now that there's enough experience with it, the truth is prevailing over the lies, the abject lies that were told to everybody about EVs. And there's probably a lot of people that have EVs out there that are pretty mad, and they're right to be mad because they were sold a bill of goods, and now we're starting to see the reality. And this is what we should see from the get-go. But it gets back to the accountability. If a government does something that's stupid and we don't punish them for it at the ballot box, why should they change their behavior?
Well, we saw, it was interesting. You look at the last election too, again, there's emotional touch points, right, that are utilized. And I think that was, people were very concerned about, vaccines and the pandemic, and maybe voted because out of fear, right? That, again, a lot of the platforms at the time talked about, anybody who questioned the vaccines were seen also as, that word of deniers, right? So
yeah, absolutely. Anti-vaxxer.
Mm-hmm.
And Trudeau did his part there. They were racist. They were science deniers. I mean, come on. It was utterly absurd, the hyperbole that people were talking. And then Canadians not standing up for each other. And of course, the farce is now, it looks like the anti-vaxxers were right. Looks like we should have been very concerned about these vaccines that we were told were so effective. Oh, maybe less effective. Oh, they're kind of 50% now. Oh, they're hurting people now. That we were sold a good bill of goods with that one as well. And I understand. I got vaccinated because we were all scared. Let's face it, it was this unknown, plague that we didn't know we were going to die, or kids were going to die or whatever. And so I understand people, but boy, we sure had a lot of misinformation, and that is such a problem.
Well, one of the things that, again, title of my show, Curious Minds, is that one of the areas that I'm really hoping more people and anybody listening, if they do nothing else, is to get more curious. And that's why I have, people like yourself and people on this show, is to ask more questions. And I often say, tables could get turned politically too. So whatever decisions are made under this government, one day there's going to be another government. And I never could understand this. And I've said this on the show. People who listen often will hear me say this. Even when it comes to free speech, like if you want to stop someone else because you don't like their opinion or views, then one day that could get turned on you. And I'm always puzzled why people don't understand that concept, because that's why I fight for it. Because I always go, even if I have someone on my show that I don't agree with, I want to, I'm giving people a platform to discuss these things as a counterbalance to other things that I'm seeing in the media too, right? Because that seems to be, and I've had other shows on that. So again, anybody listening, I've had shows talking with the media. I've had shows talking about, I've had Jim Vinosky on, and interestingly, some of the things you're saying, he's brought up in the States in terms of manufacturing and what's happening with electric vehicles. And it seems the tide is shifting. So anything you'd recommend for manufacturers now that may be starting, that already are involved in this, seeing it, like any thoughts or suggestions of where do we go next?
Well, I always encourage people to contact their MPP, MLA, MP, whatever the relevant counselor, municipal counselor, etc. People say, "Oh, waste of time." No, it's not a waste of time. It is not a waste of time. I can assure you. It doesn't take long. You don't have to. But any call that comes in, your average politician figures you probably represent about another 100 people out there, if not more, with your point of view. So they do pay attention to it for sure. So I would encourage everybody to contact their politicians, let them know what they think, including good things. The Ontario government actually recently did something very positive for not just business but households. They reversed an Ontario Energy Board decision. Well, I haven't finalized the legislation; it's in process. But the Ontario Energy Board came out with a decision that was clearly more influenced by the climate cultists, or climate zealots, whatever you want to call them, than the welfare of your average household. And it was going to discourage the use of natural gas, which is reliable, affordable, and scalable. Often, if Alberta had had more natural gas, they wouldn't have had the threat of brownouts. They've gone overboard on their use of wind turbines, and that was, anyway. I could go into that history and bore you for a very long period of time, but I won't do that. But and I made sure I put out a press release saying, "Good on you, you did the right thing. This is to benefit. It'll be beneficial to businesses, to households, and so on." Because we're all ready to criticize, we're all ready to jump on people, but you also have to tell them when they're doing something right. And so many governments, again, I've been in this business for decades, and so many governments, you say, "Oh, nobody ever thanked me before for doing a good, have a good policy." I would love to see, the accountability thing is massive. If people were really accountable in government, they are in business, because if they fail, they're affected personally. It's very rare that they're not. Um, but in government, no, you can screw up royally and nothing ever happens. In fact, you continue to earn a big fat salary, and on average, your government employee, if you compare it to the equivalent in the private sector, the government person earns more by about 15, depending on the occupation, 15 to 20%. They get a much richer pension. They retire earlier. They have a shorter work week. It's absurd. In my view, government should never have been unionized, because if you unionize an industry, if you call government an industry that has no competition, then you've just got a captive taxpayer base that you can soak ad infinitum. And that's exactly what's happening to us, because we're a high tax country. We are a high tax country. We're not getting valuable services for our tax dollars. So, the accountability piece during the pandemic, I'll use that example again. There were senior people at Health Canada and some of the oversight agencies that really screwed up big time. And all they did was got shuffled out to another job, often paying them more. What kind of message does that send to people? I'm sorry, but people should be fired, just like they are in the private sector. It's ludicrous to have these, because ultimately it just means I'm not accountable for anything. Therefore, I'm not going to bother to try to be right or try to prove my policy is actually having the the intended outcomes, and so on and so forth. So if we could ever improve that, then that would be a huge thing. Mind you, we Canadians are way too complacent, in my view. Maybe it's just because I like a good scrap or something, but we are complacent. We tolerate incompetent governments at all levels, and we really need to demand better. We deserve better. We pay a lot for government, but I understand though too. I mean, most people are busy. Look at a business owner. They used to got so many balls in the air. They never have enough time to do everything they'd like to do, even in their business, let alone their life. And people, people, your average citizen as well. Everybody's busy, so it's hard to do. But I would just say that to make even a small effort is worthwhile to do very much, and encourage people to do it. It does make a difference.
And we're after either now or after, let's put some information in for people if they want to reach out to your organization. I think that's the other thing is because you're not government funded, I think there is some information that people could get. I know I'd like to get a copy of that news release you put out about the Ontario Energy Board. And
Well, it's all on our website. It's all on our website, Gail. So
okay.
it's just CCMBC. That's our acronym. We got a bit of a turgid name, but so
So
I
is it
often debate, should we change the name? Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers. Anyway, but ccmbc.ca. We have
okay?
our press releases. We actually put out a monthly magazine that either looks at, sometimes we look at a particular politician, sometimes we look at a particular issue. It just depends on sort of what's popular at the time. That the copies of our magazine are also on our website, as we have a gala event once a year, a dinner event 2 years ago. We had Pierre Poilievre come to be our keynote. Last year it was Danielle Smith, for example. And so we had Doug Ford back a bunch of years ago, shortly after he won his first mandate. It was 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and of course everything went south for a couple of years. But it's a great event, and frankly, if anyone was interested, it's in the Toronto area, so obviously it'd have to be local although people actually do come from some other parts of the country because it is quite a good event. But people are welcome to come if they're in the business community or just people interested.
Is that the right CCMBC?
That's it.
Okay,
CCMBC.ca. Correct.
okay. So there's the website. And I also put it in the comments. And I do want to bring up another comment from Melissa. Let me just take this down. I'll put this just a minute. Let's bring up a comment from Melissa, because I think this is also a great comment. We're talking about the EVs. It goes back to consumer's choice. I found it odd that the government became so involved in marketing and regulating EVs. That did seem to be, I guess, unusual that now they became the marketing arm for this. But the question I come back to too is that it's not necessarily that an electric vehicle is 100% bad either. And what about doing a hybrid? I've questioned this for a while. How come we didn't consider going a hybrid model? Do something to.
Well, there are hybrids.
Right.
Hybrids do exist. So I guess some people have found it. Of all I've read from consumers, from a consumer perspective, and of course businesses have fleets of vehicles too, right? So I mean, this is not. It's a
Right.
business issue as well.
Right.
The hybrids seem to be, if you want to go, somewhat electric, I guess. They seem to be practical. The most practical option, at least currently. The other thing is, our technology changes all the time these days. And I am sure we'll have some different technology that'll come out sometime down the road. Of course, it's impossible to predict, but that will solve some of these issues. We don't have it right now. And to go ahead and jump to an all EV or all wind and solar biofuels heat system, for example, is too risky. We're a cold country. If you live in Costa Rica, that's a whole other ballgame. But we're a cold country, and somebody's gonna die. It's gonna be horrible if heat fails in the middle of 40 below, 50 below, which is what Alberta had a couple of weekends ago. And we can't, we don't want to, that risk should not be imposed on people by some government fiat, some government dictate. If we're in North Korea, I guess it could, but we're not in North Korea, thank goodness. And we want, we want choice as consumers, and we deserve choice as consumers. So government's trying to swing things because they're doing this for ideology. If anybody really thinks Canada, which contributes 1.4% of world emissions, is really going to make a difference, even with, if we all drove EVs, it's minuscule. It's rounding error. It's laughable. And yet we want to, basically take away choice from consumers, impose taxes on them, tax some people so we can subsidize the rich people that could already afford an EV if they wanted one. And that kind of perverse policy that has been pursued by governments. And other countries, once they drop their subsidies, suddenly EV demand goes down to virtually nothing. So that tells you something too, right? People do not want these things. May change in future, but for all the facts we know now, it's not a viable, it's not viable for more than probably a certain proportion of the population to have an EV.
And, I just talking to a wide range of people, that's something that I seem to be hearing as well, that it's almost though that the tide has turned or the pendulum has swung back, because I did feel at one point people did feel there was some pressure to think about when we were talking about it. And then now, and I think this whole discussion around the carbon tax, I think people are at a time when people are feeling very pressed on, by going to the grocery store, looking at interest rates, and then on top of it, and then even getting a rebate back for most people really is not like it didn't resonate with them. I don't think that, as they say in PR world, it didn't land very well for people.
No. Well, the other thing, the real key for all of those issues you just mentioned is facts suddenly started to come out. There was all this bump, all this stuff that was being promoted by government, and of course car makers. They like our money too, right? They like our taxpayer money. They're going to go along with government because it puts billions in their pockets. And yet not enough people had tried it yet to have the actual factual impact as to what it meant. Now that we're seeing it, we're going, whoa, I don't think so. This is all those promises that were made. They were lies. They were misleading. And like I say, shame on people, anybody, for promoting that kind of garbage that was not true, and sucking people in based on dishonesty. And that's really what, whether it's an EV, whether it's a carbon tax, that, we were all going to get money back. I love what Brad Wall, the former premier of Saskatchewan, said. He said, boy, the last time somebody told me I was going to get more back than I paid in, it was a Nigerian prince, and yeah, that was a scam. And of course, the federal parliamentary budget officer has proven that over 80% of Canadians don't get what they put in. And so that was just a bald-faced lie. And Guilbeault and the rest of the gang should be ashamed.
Well, Catherine, thank you. This has been definitely many insights, many things to, I think, for people in manufacturing, obviously think about. And I just wanted to add that, you come with a very good background in terms of your work as an economist. And I know I've heard from various other places that you spoke out in Alberta, I believe at the Alberta, was it the
Alberta Enterprise Group.
Yes.
Yeah, they're a good bunch of.
And, that's another thing, maybe a topic for another day is looking at, when I look at what sort of seems sad right now in Canada is that we have this, a country that is so diverse in terms of each province. And yet there's this sense of pitting provinces against one another, people against one another
That's appalling.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah. And that's was, the foundation of this show is to really, I like to go to what, and I have a Ted Lasso poster in my office, and I also have another poster up here that says, be curious, not judgmental. And when we start getting curious, I've often said this, and today's show is a really good example of, this is not whether you agree, this is not necessarily a pro-Trudeau, anti-Trudeau, anything like that. It's really about just looking at what is happening, ask some questions, and then make some decisions that, we need to make in terms of making a healthier economy. And this isn't just, one of the things I think that stat of 98% of businesses or whatever, under 20 people, that's that's quite startling, because I don't think many people really understand that. And
No, you're absolutely right. I've said it to politicians more times than I can count, and virtually all of them go, "Whoa, is that right?" But I think the based on fact is really the key. And we know everybody's got a bias. Everybody's got a bias. But if you strive to base any decisions on a little bit of research, a little bit of fact, easy to research these days. We have great technology for that compared to what we used to have, and so on. Because and instead of believing someone that's clearly on some kind of crusade of some kind or other and is likely misrepresenting the actual facts and so on to benefit their cause. But as you say, I am happy to debate anybody. I have no problems with people that disagree with me at all. I think it's stimulating. And
yeah,
often I'm going, you know what? You're right about that. I was wrong. Everybody is going to be wrong about something. So I totally agree. What bugs me when somebody says, oh, well, you're a denier or whatever, and therefore I'm going to cut you right off. It's like, what a stupid thing to do. That is an unintellectual, stupid, anti-growth, anti-understanding thing to do, and you're silly. So,
well, I as I say here in have my background here, let's get curious is part
I
of
saw it. Yeah.
here. And I do talk, things like sign up, suit up, and show up. And really, before you show up, it's important. The sign up part is really a mindset and having an open mindset, and then the suiting up is the research part, right? So before you can really show up, and I've often mentioned this too, I was on a debating team in high school, which is probably the best skills I developed to go into journalism, because we had to prepare both sides of an argument. And
Right.
that's often what I think is missing. We really need to understand both sides or multiple sides, and really look not just at what's on the surface, but ask why. And that's what's missing. So thank you I wanted to know why some things are happening. I think you've helped to answer some questions. So, Catherine, I'll just have you go into the green room, and I'll be there in just a bit.
Okay. Thank you,
so
dear.
much. Thank you for your time. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining in. Thank you, Melissa, for the comments today. And there is a link to the website for the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. And you can also read a bit more about Catherine's background as an economist. And one of the things about today's show really was looking at both economics, looking at what's happening in the world of energy, and where do we need to go. I will be having some more shows on this, and also at some point, just got some information today looking at what's happening in terms of nuclear as well. So thanks everybody for tuning in today, and we will see you on my channel, Curious Minds with Gail now. And please leave any comments if you have any questions further, and I can also direct them to Catherine as well. Okay, so goodbye, everybody.